Have you ever wondered how an ironclad, absolutely unbreakable national security blockade just vanishes almost overnight? Think about it. The US spent years publicly promising to starve China's AI industry, right? And then suddenly they completely reversed course, allowing the direct sale of the most powerful AI chips on Earth right back to Beijing. Well, that's exactly the core mystery we're unraveling in today's Explainer. We're looking at a policy pivot of literally unprecedented scale. No wild espionage, no cyber attacks, just ink drying on a contract that handed the most strategically important tech of the 21st century right back to America's biggest rival.
Okay, let's dive into this. The source material hits us with a pretty shocking premise right out of the gate. The AI Cold War was never really about stopping China, it was about who gets paid. Wow, right? It's a striking statement for sure. But as we look closely at the official policy documents and the paper trail left behind, it totally becomes the foundation of our entire investigation today. What was sold to us as a strict defense measure against a geopolitical rival actually transformed into something entirely different.
So let's start with Chapter 1, the Beijing Reversal.
The kind of policy U-turn we're talking about here usually takes years, sometimes decades to roll out. But instead, consider this massive 180-degree shift. Back in 2023, the Bureau of Industry and Security drew a hard line to stop China's AI labs from advancing in the AI arms race. They were actively trying to starve Chinese AI of compute power. Fast forward to the 2025 reality, the US government essentially agreed to let Nvidia sell its highly advanced H200 chips to China. But here's the catch. It was on the condition that the US takes a 15 to 25% cut of the revenue. A pure, strict blockade suddenly morphed right into a revenue-sharing agreement.
And to be clear, we aren't just talking about standard consumer electronics here. The H200 chip isn't something you're going to slap into a gaming PC. Because of the sheer massive volume of raw data passing through it, it behaves less like a traditional chip and much more like a small factory for intelligence. Stack a few thousand of these bad boys together and you've got an industrial compute cluster capable of training elite frontier AI models in weeks instead of years. Under those original export controls, this was the exact hardware that was absolutely never supposed to cross the Pacific.
So who's actually buying these small factories of intelligence? Well, the irony here is just staggering. Under the new one-year waiver system, the government approves buyers on a case-by-case basis. And guess who made the approved list? Alibaba, ByteDance, Tencent, state-backed cloud providers, and even research institutions with direct links to the People's Liberation Army. Yep, the very organizations that American policy literally spent 2 administrations trying to cripple are now legally approved buyers. And remember, once that massive compute power leaves US soil, it doesn't stay supervised.
Which brings us to Chapter 2, the billion-dollar tithe.
Let's get into the exact mechanics of how this massive loophole actually operates. Now, this wasn't some standard tax or a tariff passed by Congress. No, this was a voluntary revenue share negotiated directly between private chipmakers and the executive branch, tied entirely to export approvals. Basically, access in exchange for a cut. To get the export licenses to sell these advanced chips, Nvidia agreed to send between 15 and 25% of their Chinese chip revenue straight back to the US government, a quarter on every dollar. It's an entirely unprecedented arrangement in American trade history, fundamentally tying the government's own income to the very exports it previously labeled a national security threat.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the sheer scale of the money involved. That's what makes this pivot so remarkable. For Nvidia, the China revenue from just the downgraded H20 chip alone is measured in the tens of billions. So that 15% share they agreed to send back, it equates to $12 billion. Let that sink in for a second. $12 billion. To put that into perspective, that amount rivals the annual economies of entire countries, like the Bahamas or Madagascar. And remember, absolutely none of this money went through the usual legislative machinery.
So, the absolutely crucial point to take away is this. Export controls stopped behaving like hard, fast rules, and they started behaving like pricing terms. The geopolitical blockade was essentially transformed into a highly lucrative toll booth. If you pay more, you can ship more sensitive hardware. You can immediately see how this radically shifts the incentive structure, right? When a government actually funds itself from a corporation's exports, it suddenly has a massive financial interest in ensuring those exact exports continue.
All right, moving on to Chapter 3, Buying the Gatekeepers.
So how exactly did a private corporation engineer this whole thing without a single congressional vote? Well, as always, you have to follow the money. Back in 2024, Nvidia's lobbying spend in Washington was roughly $640,000. Pretty standard stuff. But in 2025, that number absolutely exploded to $4.95 million. That is a jump of more than 600% in a single year. And they didn't just hire anyone. They hired a dedicated, heavy-hitting team led by Ed Royce, the former chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. They brought in people who didn't just read export controls, but understood exactly how to move them and knew exactly who writes the language before it even becomes official policy.
And the timeline of this shift? It's terrifyingly fast. In May 2025, the export categories were firmly closed, period. But by August, right as the lobbying surged and those key hires were made, the rules suddenly became quote-unquote unclear. And by December 2025, the categories were basically wide open with that massive revenue sharing agreement firmly in place. This wasn't some multi-year slow-moving legislative arc. This was a highly targeted dismantling of trade barriers in a matter of mere months.
But you know, lobbying is really only half the equation here. The source material actually reveals the existence of something called the West Wing Corporate Loyalty Scorecard. This is a system that tracks 553 companies, grading their support for administration priorities based on things like social media presence, ad spend, and event attendance. Now, Nvidia's massive $15 billion domestic investment landed them perfectly on the right side of these exact metrics. What this means, impartially, is that applications aren't just judged on their technical merit anymore. A high scorecard rating essentially pre-sorts the queue, leading directly to fast-track treatment for those vital export licenses.
Which leads us straight into Chapter 4, the loophole factory.
And this brilliantly illustrates the next big question. Once a company is actually in that fast lane, how do the rules get rewritten? Well, it all comes down to market share. Nvidia absolutely dominates, holding 94% of the commercial AI chip market. The Chinese labs have practically built their entire software stacks around Nvidia's architecture. Because of this absolute dominance, the US government didn't even need to explicitly pick a winner for this revenue sharing system. By simply opening a pathway for advanced chips, the rules effectively applied almost entirely to one single company.
So how do they legally ship a chip that was explicitly banned back in 2023? They do it through this invisible three-step bureaucratic process. Step 1, you have senior closed-door meetings between the corporation and US officials. Step 2, the government issues these things called technical guidance notes, which supposedly just clarify how existing rules apply. And finally, Step 3, these notes gradually, quietly move the acceptable boundary. There are no hearings, no public votes, just dozens of small, seemingly minor technical clarifications that, when you stack them all together, shift the goalpost entirely.
The stunning reality of all this is that by engineering chips right up to the very edge of these new guidelines and actively influencing the technical parameters of those same guidelines, Nvidia is no longer just a regulated company. Think about it. They are practically co-authoring the American export rulebook in real time. What used to be a fixed legal limit has been turned into a completely negotiated threshold.
And that brings us to our final act, Chapter 5, Security for Sale.
To really evaluate the ultimate global consequences of this arrangement, we have to look outside the US. The source notes this incredibly fascinating phenomenon we can call the shadow State Department. See, Nvidia's CEO has been traveling the globe, making sovereign AI deals in places like the UAE and Saudi Arabia. But what's completely backwards here is that these commercial commitments are happening before official U.S. policy is even set. The U.S. State Department, whose job it is to coordinate the strategic transfer of technology, is instead left scrambling, adapting its own rules just to match the commercial deals Nvidia has already put in motion. It's an absolutely incredible privatization of foreign policy.
And that leaves us with the ultimate conflict. We're looking at a severe clash between national security concerns and raw economic interests. On one hand, you have a massive national security threat, providing the exact compute power that could arm a rival nation's military AI and cyber warfare systems. But on the other hand, you have the federal balance sheet, a government bureaucracy that is now eagerly projecting and relying on billions of dollars in export revenue from those very same chips. Reversing this deal right now wouldn't just be a tough political choice. It would literally mean tearing billions of dollars right out of the federal budget.
We've seen exactly how geopolitical blockades can suddenly be turned into highly lucrative revenue streams, and how exemptions to national security policy can apparently be bought at a fixed price. Trust me, other regulated industries like biotech and aerospace, they are watching this precedent very, very closely. So I'll leave you with this provocative thought. If national security has a price tag, who really wins the AI arms race? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the rules of the game.